why it is dangerous. This is why we need to be careful about, about how we deal with this issue and how we push back here in the West. Now, I will give you a recent example. Just last month, during the attack, the Israeli aggression on Gaza, 3 congressmen, Democratic congressmen, members of the House, wrote a letter to President Biden complaining about the rise of anti-Semitism. Definitely, we all condemn anti-Semitism as as a form of stereotyping, of discriminating, of targeting Jews or Jewish people just because they're Jewish. We're all against it. But let's see the examples that they used and they applied as anti-Semitic and criticizing some of their colleagues in the House who dared to speak against the Israeli atrocities that were committed or being committed against the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. So 2 of the examples that they cited as anti-Semitic is one, describing or accusing Israel of being an apartheid state. That is anti-Semitic according to them. We're talking about 3 members, the Democratic members of the House, who are accusing anyone who dares to say Israel is an apartheid state as anti-Semitic. Also, if you accuse Israel of acts of terrorism, you are anti-Semitic. So how do you deal with such a situation? We have to reject any conflation between Israel as a state and Judaism as a religion, Zionism as an ideology, Judaism as a religion. And Israel is not the embodiment of Judaism and is not the embodiment of the Jewish people. And this is a right that we have, a right we have to say, and we have the right to say it, and we should not be deterred by these tactics, as they have done recently to Ilhan Omar, the congresswoman from Minnesota, when she accused Israel of war crimes, equated Israel, now that's according to her, she said that Israel is guilty as Hamas of war crimes, and the United States is guilty as Taliban of war crimes. Now, I am not here in the business of validating what she said or refuting in what she said. But she is entitled to say what she believes in. This is what the First Amendment is about in this country. She is entitled to say what she believes in. Now, the issue is, or the irony is that when she was attacked, she wasn't attacked mainly on the basis of equating the American behavior or actions to Taliban's actions. In fact, she was attacked for equating Israel's behavior to Hamas's behavior. So it was mainly focused on anti-Semitism, not anti-Americanism. And that is a serious problem, but also, again, it provides us with another opportunity, meaning that when you start infringing on our freedom of expression, you will have more opponents who will be pushing back against you, because this is trying to define a state in a certain way, in a certain image, and no one has the right to disagree with you, and no one will accept it. So I would say that Israel and its apologists going overboard are providing us with opportunities to push back and say, now this issue, you are infringing on our freedom of expression, a right that we cherish, and a right that is stipulated not only in the Constitution, we say by definition that this is our God-given right, as we believe here. So this is, again, it's a real challenge, but also it's providing us an opportunity that we need to capitalize on. Now, another challenge that we're facing that I mentioned earlier, that there is a religious component, there is a religious dimension, mainly within the Protestants and specifically within the evangelicals. Now, the evangelicals in the United States, for example, constitute about 25% of the population. In 2016, 80% of them voted for Trump. 80% of them voted for Trump. Therefore, when Trump made a decision to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of the state of Israel in December 2017, he was catering in part to this a huge base and very influential base here in the United States. He was catering to them. And for the evangelicals, the issue of Jerusalem and the issue of moving the embassy later on is not a political issue. It is more of a religious issue, an issue that has to deal with a theology called the Armageddon Theology, which in essence is an anti-Semitic theology, because this is the a precondition for the return of the second return of the Messiah, and then Jews will be given the option either to convert to Christianity or they will be dealt with in a violent way. So this is an anti-Semitic theology in itself, and Israel sees evangelicals as their real base in America. According to Ron Dramer, the former Israeli ambassador to the United States, he advised Israel not to waste its energy on trying to pursue the Jewish community in the United States that he calls or refers to as disproportionately critical of Israel. Rather, Israel should focus on the evangelicals here in the United States. That's his advice to the state of Israel. So they understand that the cornerstone of the U.S. support of Israel now lies within this community here. And we know now that Israel is becoming more of a political issue, more of it's no longer a matter of consensus. It's no longer transcends political affiliation, with more Democrats becoming more critical of Israel and more assertive on Palestinian rights. They know that Republicans now are more supportive, but even the Republicans who are more supportive of Israel are not entirely supportive if you take out the evangelicals out of the equation who populated the Republican Party. So now we're talking about new dynamics. It doesn't end there. Even within the millennials now, and I will come to this, even within millennials, within the evangelical community, they are moving away slowly but gradually from Israel. So they're unlike their parents, they are more critical of Israel because of what they see coming from Israel, the ugly face that is coming from Israel and its policies. So again, this provides us with another opportunity that we need to understand. I know that I'm going over time, but I will get to some of the opportunities that we can capitalize on. You know, many people think that that the Trump era hurt the Palestinians and hurt their cause. I would say definitely yes, but also provided us with another opportunity, because the Trump camp created a hate camp in America. And it became the camp of intolerance, and everyone who joined that camp, everyone who apologized for that camp, became a member of his camp, the camp of hate. Netanyahu, when he was a prime minister, joined that camp out of political expediency, to the point where Israeli politicians, Israeli experts, the security and the intelligence apparatuses in Israel were warning against this unholy marriage between the two. And they said that this comes at the expense of the strategic relationship between the two countries. Netanyahu defined Israel as an apartheid state, as a brutal state. And that helped the Palestinian movement and the Palestinian solidarity movement in the US. Because at that time, we also had an issue of race in America. We were dealing with the issue of white supremacy that we still deal with here in the United States. We were dealing with institutionalized racism. We were dealing, and we are still, of course, dealing with these things, with police brutality. And when the facts start coming out that, you know, our police force here is being trained by Israeli security experts, the way that Floyd was killed by a police officer, this is a tactic that, you know, the Israeli experts taught and trained our police force here in the US. This created a new dimension, a new depth for the Palestine solidarity movement. Suddenly, Palestine became a civil rights issue, a social justice issue. And when you look at statements coming from the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, or coming from Latino Americans or Asian Americans who are being, of course, subjected now to more racism coming from members of Congress who subscribe to the progressive wing or affiliated with the progressive wing, this comes within this context where Israel now is being, drawn into the hate camp that Trump created or helped created or helped maintain and amplify. So this is one area where we can work on. Palestine is a civil rights issue. Palestine is a social justice issue. Palestine is about is about institutionalized racism. And according to data here in the US, many, more Americans or more millennials, draw a parallel between the situation in Palestine that exists, the apartheid regime that is being imposed on the Palestinian people, to the Jim Crow laws in this country, that enforced racial segregation in the southern United States and elsewhere within the United States. And we all know that the Jim Crow laws were a body of laws were institutionalized to disadvantage African Americans economically, educationally, and socially. And people are drawing parallels now. We have to capitalize on this. All what we have to do is to expose these facts, is to surface these facts for people to see them, for people to know what exactly is taking place in Palestine and what Israel really stands for. Now, there are other points that I wanted to focus on, mainly in continuing to raise awareness and translate this into political leverage, meaning raising awareness and continuing to advance knowledge about Palestine and this real situation in Palestine will lead us nowhere unless we leverage this politically, unless we consolidate our efforts to provide either a safety net to those who dare to speak for Palestine, politicians who dare to speak for Palestinian rights, or make sure that there will be consequences for those who dare to support Israel's subjugation of the Palestinian people. This is part of the work that, like an organization like the one I'm hearing, the American Muslims for Palestine, is working on. I see the same is happening in definitely in the US. There are many organizations that doing this work, but I see the same happening in Europe and in the Western Hemisphere. This is something that we need to continue to capitalize on. While we're raising public awareness, we have to make sure that this public awareness is translated into political leverage. Meaning, and I will cite a last example here, for the past 10 years, 79% of the American people are for stricter gun laws in this country. For over 10 years now, the 79% so far have failed in impacting the gun laws in this country. And the reason that is given to this, the justification or the analysis behind this, is that the 79% are less passionate, less enthusiastic about what they stand for in relation to this issue, as compared to those who are for the current gun laws. Meaning, if we are not enthusiastic and we're not passionate, and we don't put the different pieces that we have into motion, nothing will change. And we have to continue building this pressure campaign until we get to a point where at least Israel is exposed for what it is, and it is no longer prohibited to speak about Israel as for what it represents. And we're no longer deterred by these smearing tactics of accusing us of being anti-Semitic, self-hating Jews, Israel haters, terrorist apologists. Until we're no longer deterred speaking about this, things will not change in this country. But we are on the right trajectory, and the tide is shifting, and we have to invest in it to reach the destination that we all aspire and we all hope to for. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Osama Abu Rashed. Next, we have Tahir Labadi. Tahir is a research associate at LEST, Aix-Marseille University, and at the French Institute of the Near East. He received his PhD on the political economy of colonialism in Palestine from Paris Dauphine University in 2015. His research interests lie at the intersection of economic policies and reform, conflict management, resistance to colonialism, and knowledge production in the Middle East. Tahir Labadi has authored numerous research papers and articles on Middle Eastern economies, including Palestine. His current research focuses on the political economy of export processing zones and of labor migration in Jordan. Tahir is going to be speaking about the role of economics in the struggle against occupation and apartheid. Tahir, thank you so much.
شكرا نورا.
Thank you, Nora, and I thank CIGA and all the organizers for giving me the opportunity to give some ideas about the role of economy in the apartheid, the issue of the economics of resistance and studies which have grown in number around the economics of resistance recently, in addition to an increased number of conferences and symposia around resistance through economics and through food security over the past 10 years. In an attempt to criticize the what's so-called the Oslo Economics, those who contributed to those meetings and conferences questioned the fundamentals of an alternative model for economic development in Palestine. And what I mean by the economics of Oslo is the economic system that was interpreted on the ground as a further dependency on Israel. For example, the programs that we can find which work on securing food security in Palestine and which are backed or funded by international donors, those programs focus or are interested in access to international markets, and farmers in Palestine, just like anywhere else in the world, are required to be specialized in crops that are for exportation rather than local consumption, because those crops provide more significant financial profits. So, for example, in Gaza, farmers were required to focus on planting strawberries, flowers, and tomatoes. And the problem with this produce is that they are vulnerable to the fluctuation of access through crossing points and the checkpoints and the borders with Israel. So the economics of resistance aims at the opposite, which is to be an economic system that supports Palestinians in their struggle against the Israeli occupation. So the economic resistance follows a different reading of the reality, which is because the existing reading was based on a neoliberal reading of the situation, because it's based on international donors. But the alternative economic system we're talking about is based on internal considerations, apart from the looting of land, theft of land and resources. Israelis have always wanted to stop any economic independence that would lead into a political independence. At the same time, the siege was one of the means of pressure to choke the Palestinian community. Here, I will not discuss the colonial economic system used by Israel using looting, land theft, and expulsion of Palestinians from their own lands. But I will focus more on the alternative economics of resistance. So, because the ideas that are proposed in that context are usually reconsider and research the experience in the first Intifada as a local example of popular mobilization and a rupture with the colonial system and its production methods. So I'm going to use two further Palestinian models apart from the first Intifada that are more recent, and we may conclude some lessons from those experiences that may translate into the economics of liberation. First is the initiative of forming the so-called independent or self-dependent community, which was formed by the Islamic movement after the Second Intifada in order to minimize the dependency of Palestinian people on the Israeli economy and to support the formation of Palestinian institutions and Palestinian economy. So the idea simply was to confront these impoverishment policies and theft policies, and in addition to confronting the containment operations used by the donors and the Israeli institutions, as through those policies they wanted to maximize dependency and increase the fragility of the Palestinian community under the pressure and oppression of the Israeli authority by preventing the development of an independent Palestine and and prevent integration into the Israeli economy.
So this self-reliance economy started after the second Intifada, and it depended on local funding and resources. All the resources, of course, were put to the service of the institutions and services that work in different fields, including especially in the economy, health, education, culture, media, etc., etc. So the idea was to cover the civil needs in the Palestinian society without depending on the Israeli resources or institutions. Indeed, this project allowed to establish a number of civil organizations and companies that provided aid for the orphans and the poor and supported the families of the martyrs and the captives. In health, they created clinics, and in education, they established schools, as well as providing scholarships for higher education. and they also contributed to reconstruction, to rebuilding the buildings that were destroyed by the Israelis. This program also allowed to establish funds and research centers specialized in supporting the community-based organizations inside the area. This is the first the first program. The other program was the agriculture development program under the siege in Gaza Strip. This experience is still unknown, but it deserves to be looked at a little bit. This program allowed the local agriculture sector to cover an increasing part of the food needs in Gaza Strip. This to the level that it allowed to the government of the Gaza Strip step by step to control and even prevent importing a number of the agricultural products that were coming from Israel or from Egypt. This initiative was put forward by the Ministry of Agriculture in Gaza after the siege in 2007 by adopting a new strategy that aims at maximizing or increasing the food sovereignty, again depending on local resources and capabilities, and of course it has a political aspect. The idea was to minimize the dependency on the economy of the occupation and not to keep Gaza weak and susceptible to foreign pressure. This was put also to the economy of the solid steadfastness and resistance. So the agriculture ministry worked on a program of sustainable development by targeting resources that are rare in Gaza Strip and making products that can be sustained in Gaza at the same time to maintain the environment inside Gaza. So this program was a solution for adapting to the siege and not to exhaust the water resources or other resources that are scarce in Gaza. Some of the techniques that were used water harvesting, for example, water harvesting agriculture using natural or organic chemical or pesticides, fertilizers, instead of those that were imported from Israel. That was in the agriculture field. In the first phase, there were a number of farmers or NGOs, universities, or farmers associations benefited from this program. They were put together into meetings. These meetings would discuss things related to the program, and ultimately the ministry was able to serve the agricultural sector to cover or to increase the agricultural products provided. In phase two, the role of the ministry was to help farmers to adopt this new plan. This included the provision of equipment, and the agricultural inputs, including seeds, fertilizers, and seedlings. Some of the products or some of the agrarian lands were on the borders with the Israelis, uh, s- and they also, the program depended on the local market for the outputs to be marketed there. Uh, there were the pilot farms that provided the farmers with the seedlings and seeds, etc. They also created incubators and fish tanks for fish farming, as well as uh, poultry farming. The ministry worked with universities and in cooperation with the farmers who were trained to fulfill this plan. For example, in 2009, the agricultural sector under the siege in Gaza was able to cover about 90% of the vegetables needs, 50% of the fruit needs within the Gaza Strip, 90% of the poultry, 70% of the fish needs. These numbers maintained, or actually they were increased by the years. But here we need to say that with every war against Gaza, it is specific in 2014 and now in May 2021, the establishments of the agriculture ministry were targeted, and so many of the facilities affiliated to the ministry were destroyed during these wars due to the bombardment. So what I want to show here is that we have these two experiences, the experience in Gaza and another experience inside Palestine. They are facing difficulties related to the Palestinian oppression, uh, which make these experience unable to reach the level of stability. The same thing with the program of the self-reliance community inside Palestine after 2015, when the Israelis decided to prevent the Islamic movement, and they closed a number of the institutions and companies that were working in under this program. And the same was in Gaza, as I said, the farms and the factories that were destroyed, that are prone to destruction with every war. So the Palestinians are unable to control their borders, and they are working in sporadic land. So this adds to the difficulties that they have. The importance of the experience in Gaza is that for the first time, it is a unique situation, and this situation allowed to have a political decision at the higher level, which allowed not only as we see in the West Bank for associations that work on an economy of resistance. No, here we had policies, economic policies that supported that line of thinking. Some of the lessons learned from these experiences. First, the economy of resistance is the economy that aims at minimizing the dependency of the Palestinians to Israeli institutions or economy. It is the economy that disengages with the Israeli occupying system, and not only with the mentality of boycotting the Israelis, to harm the Israeli interests, but also to create the conditions for the economic independence through which there could be a Palestinian political independence. The second lesson is that the economy of resistance covers the needs of the Palestinian community, society in agriculture, health, and education, as well as services. And most importantly, this program aimed at developing health facilities, education, and culture facilities that are independent and effective within the society. The third lesson is that the economy of resistance is in the service of the struggle of the struggle of liberation. It supports the marginalized, including the families of the martyrs and the captives. It contributes to the reconstruction and raising awareness of the new generations. So the idea here is not only to increase the living conditions of the Palestinians and generate new job opportunities for Palestinian workers. In addition, it also aims at encouraging some professions that are needed by the struggling or the resisting community. Finally, to conclude, I can say that the economy of resistance is a critical step towards liberation. It prepares the society for liberation and it lays the foundations for liberation. And actually, it is a day-to-day process of liberation when we find that the Palestinian society is liberating itself from the dependency on the Israeli economy. This economy will have also an important role in specifying the values, the principles, conditions, the form and content of the Palestinian liberation and the liberation of Palestine at large. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Taher Labadi. That was fantastic. And we do have some questions for each of our panelists. We'll get to those right after a presentation by Dr. Omar Zaza. Omar is a writer, activist for Palestine, and is currently the Education and Advocacy Coordinator for Eyewitness Palestine and a member of the Palestinian Youth Movement. They received their PhD in Comparative Literature at the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA, in 2020. Mabruk. Omar's PhD dissertation was titled Undercover and Hypervisible: Security Poetics and Pacification Prosaics in African American and Arab American Literature. Their dissertation analyzes how racialized subjects subjected to hypersurveillance and policing use creative expression as a means of capturing and resisting these processes of discriminatory disciplinarity, as well as anticipating new possibilities of social and worldly conviviality. Love that. Omar's political articles on Palestine have appeared in outlets spanning from Mondoweiss, the Huffington Post, and the New York Times. And Omar's academic publications on Palestine, settler colonialism, and Zionist repression have appeared in or are forthcoming from publications including Transmotion and Arab Studies Quarterly. Omar's abstract is entitled Narrative Unravelings, a tripartite personal assessment of the nonprofit, academic, and grassroots role in challenging Israeli apartheid propaganda. Dr. Omar Zaza.
Thank you, Nora. And just want to start by saying hello to everyone. Good evening, good afternoon, or good morning, depending on where you're tuning in from. And I also want to say what an honor it is to be here with you all and speaking alongside such an amazing array of panelists representing the very best of scholars and activists on Palestine. And of course, all of the positionalities in between those two poles. And it's precisely that sort of interstitial interconnection that I would like to spend the next few minutes talking about with all of you today. For as was basically mentioned, by the generous biography, an individual continues to move back and forth between several interrelated yet slightly distinct spheres by way of personal history and current profession. So I won't go into too much detail, but I'll just mention briefly some of the different spaces that I've been navigating. So from 2012 to 2020, as was mentioned, I was pursuing a PhD at UCLA. And during this period, I was also heavily involved in campus activism, primarily through UCLA's chapter of Students for Justice in Palestine. From 2015 to the present, I've been a member of the Palestinian Youth Movement, which is a grassroots collective of Palestinian and or Arab youth that seeks to guide the newer generations to become agents of change in fighting for the total liberation of our homeland and people. And as of July 2020, I've been the education advocacy coordinator for the nonprofit organization Eyewitness Palestine, which leads political delegations to Palestine and creates educational materials and campaigns related to the Palestinian struggle. So there's a lot to say about this latest capacity, but just two things that I want to mention at this moment is that the delegations we design are intended to serve as a conscious alternative to the pro-biblical colonial tourism propagated by the Israeli state. And, a good example of that we're seeing right now is the Zionist attempt to displace Palestinian families of Silwan to create a biblically themed park. And also that we operate from a theory of change that calls on all participants to become advocates and activists for Palestine upon their return. So the opportunity is not simply to be thought of as a free trip, but the beginning of a lifelong process of accountability of working for freedom for the Palestinians, about whose struggle they will learn through travel and engagement. And for those in the audience who are listening and wondering how we've been able to do this work during the pandemic, everything, including our delegations and events, has become virtual for the time being, though we are planning for an in-person environmentalism-themed delegation this coming fall. And finally, just to conclude this qualification section, I'm also a member of the US campaign for the cultural and academic boycott of Israel. So I mentioned all of that just to lay out that I have sort of grounding in at least three different contexts concerning the Palestinian struggle in the US: the academic, the grassroots, and the nonprofit. And what I'd like to do today is share some individual assessments on the role that I think each of these spaces can and should play in advancing the Palestinian liberation struggle and challenging what we might think of as the epistemological preeminence of Zionism in the cultural sphere. And here I'll just give a few disclaimers. First of all, I'm speaking primarily from within a US context, as that's where I'm based. Secondly, I don't presume to be presenting a definitive treatise on the interconnected role these spaces play in challenging Zionism, as I'm one person with a particular perspective and a limited history in navigating them. But what I will do today is share with you all what I believe to be the current role these spaces can play in meeting these goals as I have experienced it. So this will be, as the title clarifies, a tripartite personal reflection on this topic. So to return to the phrase I used earlier, challenging the epistemological preeminence of Zionism in the cultural sphere, what I mean by this is fairly straightforward. Epistemology, as we know, denotes the origins and the limitations of knowledge, as well as what establishes the basis for knowledge criteria. The Zionist project, as many scholars have pointed out, is not merely one of physical colonization, but also one of cultural domination. It is paramount that the Zionist narrative becomes the default in the cultural arena, the ultimate ur-text against which various other narratological threads and perspectives are measured and challenged. And when I say culture and even narrative, I'm not excluding what is oftentimes referred to as mainstream media, or as I prefer, given the current point in time, corporate media. And I don't think that distinction or lack thereof is particularly novel or even remarkable to make. After all, several decades of structuralist and post-structuralist scholarship have been dedicated to exploring how textual character is by no means the exclusive province of so-called official literary forms, and that it is possible to probe the narrative conventions of supposedly non-literary pronouncements regardless of specialization. So the Zionist narrative is not confined to a single text. It is also a series of codes and tropes that have come to inform establishment cultural messaging. An important way to understand how this operates is through the concept of hegemony, which Edward Said used as one of his touchstones in exploring the pervasiveness of Orientalist logics in academia and media discourse. Originally formulated by the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci, hegemony refers to how ruling class sensibilities can become dominant in the civil society through non-coercive means. The way, according to Gramsci, to counter hegemony is through a war of position that will challenge the domination within culture of the terms that reinforce political subordination. Zionism, especially following 1967, more on this in a moment, is an important component of US hegemonic cultural sensibilities. It's for this reason that the theme of my reflections today is clustered around the notion of narrative unravelings. Because when we understand Zionism as a constitutive element in the manufacturing of white supremacist, capitalist, and imperial common sense among the differentially subordinated populace, we see why it is erroneous to think that such an entrenched political cultural grammar will simply be undone with one decisive blow or even a series of blows. Rather, we need to see our work as cumulative, as gradual, as meticulously taking apart what has been so intentionally and strategically sewn in place. Here we already have a good demonstration of the type of phenomenon I wanted to explore in this brief discussion, the interrelatedness of converging spheres in challenging Zionist hegemony and advancing Palestinian liberation through the aforementioned example of Edward Said. Sorry, just one moment. So Said obviously wrote the groundbreaking text Orientalism, which analyzed how seemingly impartial scholarship and media messaging service the projects of colonial and imperial domination and subjugation. So on the one hand, Said authored a text that took to task the epistemological presumptions of academic impartiality regarding the study and analysis of the Near East. But that's only one side of the story. For as examined by scholars such as Sarah Gualtieri, Andrew Rubin, and Keith Feldman, Said was also a member of the Association of Arab American University Graduates, or AAUG, alongside his friend and mentor Ibrahim Abalugud, who had previously been involved with the Organization of Arab Students, or OAS. The AAUG was an organization dedicated to challenging the rampant demonization of Arabs, particularly Palestinians and Muslims, following the aftermath of 1967, during which the Israeli state launched a preemptive strike against Egypt, Jordan, and Syria and seized the Gaza Strip, West Bank, and the Syrian Golan Heights. Through its various publications, which included the journal Arab Studies Quarterly, the AAUG sought to act as an academic counterweight to the racist and dehumanizing representations of the media. The two essays authored by Said, who acted as the vice president of the organization for a time, would include the seeds of the arguments he would later explore in his field-defining text Orientalism. These two essays are The Arab Portrayed from 1969 and Shattered Myths from 1975. And for those who haven't seen them, both are worth reading. Shattered Myths in particular is fascinating because here Said is already referring to Orientalism, which he categorizes as a myth, quote unquote, that includes presumptions such as the essential singularity and bloodthirsty nature of something called the Arab mind, quote unquote, that can be the specialization of US intelligence. And here I'm referring to intelligence in the government sense. What Said examined in this essay was how the widely reiterated trope of an intelligence failure, quote unquote, was used to explain how the Arabs, quote unquote, could even be expected to have fought of their own accord. Not that is that they fought well, but that they fought at all. And that's a direct quote. The surprise was not that they fought well, but that they fought at all. Thus, the 1973 war, sometimes referred to as the October War, represented a kind of shattering of some of the prime conventions of the Orientalist myth, including the essential simplicity of the so-called Arab mind, which was so unfathomable that the facts on the ground had to be contorted by the US and Israeli political establishments as having resulted from an intelligence failure. So why am I spending so much time on this? And I think it's an important reflection of the topic I'd like to discuss, the narrative unravelings to which we need to subject the Zionist presumptions of US hegemony. Essential to this undertaking is understanding that academia is in no way isolated from the political media establishment, and acting on this understanding by straddling multiple spheres as scholars, intellectuals, and organizers. And on the final point, brilliant as he was, the work that Said did and its legacy is not reducible to him alone as an individual. It grows out of a wider context of organizing and activism that involves the aforementioned OAS, AAUG, as well as the General Union of Palestinian Students and others. Similarly, those of us who come to the academic context from grassroots organizing and activist spaces don't simply leave those sensibilities at the door when we enter the classroom. We need to hold on to them, especially when we're engaged in the intellectual act of challenging dominant logics and rhetorics of supremacy. And at the risk of digressing, I also think we need to carefully scrutinize the tendency to dismiss intellectual work as interchangeable with anything academic. Academia as an institution in the US, which was fortified through various racist and genocidal projects such as settler colonialism and slavery, and today remains invested in weapons companies and helping police forces develop technologies to better surveil oppressed and working class communities of color, is certainly an oppressive space. Internally as well as externally, when we also recall the vast repression to which academics who dare to speak out in support of Palestine have been subjected. But academia today actually relies on the assumption that knowledge production is exclusive to it to continue to perform this oppressive work invisibly. By contrast, I think simply reflecting back on liberation luminaries such as Ghassan Kanafani, who wrote myriad studies of Zionism and imperialism, as well as the countless Palestinians organizing in the camps who considered political education to be just as crucial as armed struggle, will remind us that it is actually the duty of individuals involved in liberation struggles to document and archive their condition. That is, there is an aspect of the liberation struggle that is indisputably intellectual, and it's incumbent upon all of us to own that rather than taking academia at the word of its false branding. So to get back to the topic at hand, it's not only in the broader socio-political culture of the US that Zionism acts as a hegemonic force. In my experience, universities have become a space in which Zionism is particularly entrenched. And I say particularly because it's been my experience that Zionism over the past few years has relied on particular narrative strategies to ensure that university spaces themselves embrace a hegemonic culture that sees Zionism as the basis for ethical conduct and intellectual integrity. Two of these strategies that I've identified are those of exceptionalization and co-optation. Exceptionalization means quite simply trying to get people to second guess the nature of Israeli oppression and violence against Palestinians by making it seem as though there is more than meets the eye. So for example, accusing Israel of apartheid, and I know it's the first time I've used that word in a panel session dedicated to it, for years would be met with responses like, it's not what it looks like. And because South Africa became the basis for the legally actionable crime of apartheid, Zionists would often try to delegitimize the charge by saying how Israel was nothing like apartheid South Africa, conveniently overlooking the fact that the charge simply requires proving systematic intent, not total equivalence. And co-optation, as you might imagine, refers to the appropriation of various strategies and frameworks from liberation, anti-racist, and civil rights struggles in order to normalize Zionist as an oppressed identity, and conversely, Palestine organizing and activism is inherently oppressive. And I know very happy that Dr. Osama set up a lot of what I'm going to get into in this particular section. So this co-optation, as documented by the legal organization Palestine Legal, relied on tactics such as suing universities for violating Zionist students' civil rights by allowing for Palestine activism and scholarship to take place within university settings. These tactics have also played out at the state government level, with several states passing anti-BDS bills that attempt to ban businesses from participating in BDS work, relying on the false narrative of victimization of Zionists to sanction the legal codification of actual discrimination against Palestinians and our allies. And of course, there was the Trump administration's executive order, which completely equated Judaism and Zionism and reinforced the logics of the Title VI complaints often filed by Zionist organizations against universities. In 2016, the Regents of the University of California attempted to pass a statement of principles against intolerance that directly equated anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. Many of us organized against that, and instead the Regents passed an altered form that condemned anti-Semitic forms of anti-Zionism. This, of course, has a wider history. Keith Feldman notes that the aftermath of 1967 in many ways began the linking of anti-Semitism with Palestine work that is so rampant today, and that this process evolved in line with a related convention of Zionist organizations beginning to frame anti-Semitism as something that needed to be examined and analyzed by experts because it could erupt at any moment. It had, that is, a viral characteristic, as Feldman explains, and because of this virality, it was important to defer to so-called civil rights organizations such as the Anti-Defamation League, which is in fact a Zionist organization dedicated to surveilling and smearing pro-Palestine racial justice activists, to stamp it out. Not so surprisingly, these recommendations usually entailed investigating and questioning activists for Palestine and other racial justice struggles. The FBI's COINTELPRO operation, which surveilled scores of activists, mirrored the exact rhetoric that would be pushed by Zionist organizations such as the ADL in labeling Black liberation, Black nationalism, and Palestine activism, and of course the intersection between all of these as rooted in hatred, extremism, or terrorism, and thereby necessitating further government scrutiny. So what do we need to keep in mind when it comes to challenging not only Israeli apartheid, but also the various ways in which Zionism seeks to normalize itself within various establishment spaces? I think one thing is certainly to keep spreading the message and to keep pushing the envelope as much as possible. I remember the days when even saying apartheid was seen as somehow radical or controversial, and now B'Tselem and Human Rights Watch have both released reports attesting to the veracity of that claim. Meanwhile, Palestinians have been making the charge for decades, so we have to keep saying the same things, repeating the same arguments, and never compromising our principles in the hopes that what seems impossible today can be taken for granted tomorrow. Secondly, we have to keep seizing upon breaks in the larger Zionist narrative. Said wrote of the shattered myths of Orientalism, and later in his arguably more famous media essay, Permission to Narrate, talked about the 1982 Sabra Shatila massacre in Lebanon. And some of you may recall that there was a hitherto unprecedented media situation at that time. There were more reporters on the ground able to report directly what they were seeing and experiencing, which led to the first immediate transmission of images and accounts of brutal Israeli violence. Regina Sharif would conclude the 1983 seminal study, Non-Jewish Zionism, by reflecting that the revelation of Israel's brutality would have to force a frank reckoning with the structural nature of the Zionist project. Today, such a pronouncement may seem overstated, and yet we can discern a continuing pattern. As communications technologies enhance and expand, the Israeli state in some ways loses its narrative monopoly. And I think it's worth noting that operations like 2008's Cast-led, 2014's Protective Edge always bring more and more activists to the Palestinian cause, while the types of defenses for Israeli violence that could have worked at one period in time become insufficient at another. Today, social media has played a huge role in bringing even more widespread awareness to the Palestinian cause, as activists like Mohammed and Muna al-Kurd have taken to Twitter and Instagram to document in real time Israeli settler violence and attempts to displace the Palestinian families of Sheikh Jarrah, and so on. Of course, social media is a double-edged sword here, given that these same platforms have been systematically censoring and silencing Palestinians, even erasing or shadow banning the very content mentioned. Facebook has also been actively deleting Palestinian accounts, including those of entire academic programs that center Palestine, such as San Francisco State's Arab and Muslim Ethnicities and Diasporas program. And Zoom and YouTube also took part in censoring an open classroom by this aforementioned program, which is headed by a Palestinian activist scholar, Dr. Rabab Abdul Hadi. Israel, perhaps realizing the efficacy of digital technologies and displacing the premium of corporate imperial capitalist reporting, has over the past few years been partnering with Silicon Valley tech companies to ensure that Palestinian content is censored as violations of so-called community standards, including the promotion of terrorism, quote unquote. And we can talk more about this in the Q&A if desired. However, we definitely seem to be in a moment, and I think the uprisings that followed the police murder of George Floyd, including the subsequent reckonings with white supremacy, helped create an atmosphere of dissension whereby what was previously taken for granted is no longer fully tolerable. And this has certainly percolated into the current discourse on Palestine. We've seen academic departments sign various solidarity statements with the Palestinian struggle, and academics pledge to teach Palestine in a politically unfiltered way. And by way of closing, assuming I'm probably over time or getting close to it, I just want to mention what I think should be the relationship between the grassroots and the nonprofit spheres. As I see it, the grassroots and nonprofit spaces can sometimes seem antagonistic, and this can be healthy to the degree that it ensures awareness that the two are not interchangeable. However, I do think they can work relationally. Ultimately, I think it should be the role of the nonprofit sphere to prop up the grassroots spaces with resources and take directives from them. The nonprofits will mediate the public sphere in a way that the grassroots will not always have the capacity to do, though the efforts can certainly blur. And in these moments, it's important to ensure that the messaging is not watered down. The nonprofits are not the grassroots and vice versa, and that's exactly how it should be. So in closing, I'll just say that we need to keep pushing the envelope and challenging the narrative conventions that make seemingly unchallengeable projects like Israel's ongoing colonization of Palestine or the US's subsidization of this colonization possible. The current status quo, with its decentering of the role of the so-called colonial expert, poses new opportunities to do so, even as it's certainly fraught with unique challenges of its own. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Omar Zaza. So we have some questions that I received in the chat. I think I'm just going to go through them in the order that they were received. The first one is for John Quigley. What recommendations would you give so that Palestinians and pro-Palestinian supporters could utilize the law to advance the cause, whether in US courts or other jurisdictions? And are there any steps that NGOs and individuals could do, legally speaking? Can we be on the offense, or should we always play defense when it comes to the law?
Oh, that's a very important question. Thank you very much, Nora. I think that the answer is to go on the offense. And I think we really have a unique opportunity with the creation of the commission that the Human Rights Council is now creating. I think that NGOs need to focus on the essential issues in the Palestine conflict. The status of Jerusalem, repatriation, and in particular, the creation of this commission with the focus on root causes opens an avenue that never existed before to have an international body make a determination that the act of denying repatriation is a crime against humanity that qualifies as the crime of apartheid, which is a crime under the International Court Statute. I mean, that's not just a matter of rhetoric, as some have tried to say. It is an actual crime defined by treaty, the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. So I think there is an opportunity here that has never existed before, and that we really need to take advantage of.
Thank you. And to our other panelists, feel free to jump in and we can do kind of an ad hoc discussion as well. This one is for Osama. The history of advocacy for Palestine in the US has not been very effective, even though that is slowly changing. The question is, part of the reason for this ineffectiveness is that there are mixed messages. Some advocate for two states, while others are for one state, while some call for Islamic or secular states. Can we have a unifying message, namely to dismantle the Zionist racist nature of the regime in Palestine, the settler colonialism, the Israeli apartheid system, which is the main reason and cause of the conflict? Put simply, our struggle now is to dismantle apartheid and not determine the future of what happens next. In that case, we could unify all our efforts instead of wasting our energies. What's your response and answer to that?
Yeah, well, I would agree with the first part of the question, that our work was not effective in the past. It is gaining momentum and it's becoming more effective now. And what I mean by now is not just in this year, but for the past few years. We have seen a real shift here in relation to Palestine in the US. And I wouldn't characterize it as such. It is because that we cannot agree on a formal solution, whether a two-state, one-state, secular state, binational, democratic. I don't think that this is the problem. The problem that we didn't find our niche here in the US before. Now we found it. I think focusing on human rights, Palestinian rights, the humanization of Palestinians is what is needed here. Now, in terms of what solution we're seeking, I think, yes, Some of us who might talk about a two-state solution. Some of us might talk about a one-state solution where all people in Palestine are equal. But I don't think that this is the main problem. The main problem is fighting for the human rights of the Palestinians and framing Israel as it is. And that's where our focus should be. If we succeed in framing Israel as is, in portraying Israel as is, as a brutal apartheid regime, an occupier, that will help our cause, because then we could be talking about what form of a solution we're looking for. But until then, things will not change. But I see there is now a real momentum here in the US, mainly when it comes to the social justice movement in America, where Palestine now became an integral part of it. When we had the demonstrations in the US streets, the Black Lives Matter demonstrations, Palestine was at the center, at the heart of these demonstrations. Yes, it wasn't the main issue, but it was one of the issues that were brought up. People were talking about deadly exchange, where again, that I alluded to, where it is Israeli security experts train our police force to disperse or how to deal with the civilian demonstrations here, because they claim that they have the expertise dealing with the Intifada and with the Palestinians. So people are seeing the parallels when they also, again, as I mentioned, equate the situation in Palestine, occupied Palestine, to the Jim Crow era here in the US. That is a very important parallel that has been created. So I think, no, we're gaining momentum. It is not about a one-state or two-state solution. People can advocate for either, but the bottom line is going to be what Israel stands for, what Israel is really about, and what the Palestinians are suffering from and under. So once we establish this and once we give it that momentum that is needed here, where again it becomes a pressing political issue. And I think we have, and I'll conclude with this, we have a good opening here in the US, even in terms of policy, in terms of the policymakers. The US now wants to focus mostly on China, a rising China. Even when Biden was meeting with Putin, in the back of his mind, it was China. Everything is about China, is about containing China, keeping Russia away from China, because Russia is not the real threat to the United States and to its hegemony worldwide. So that provides us with another opening where the Middle East becomes a headache to the United States. It's not the cancer that it needs to treat, if you would accept this analogy. So that gives us another opening where we can hopefully leverage our momentum and the movement, the solidarity movement for Palestine here in the US, to align with the broader US objectives. It's not that I am for containing China or fighting China. No, I'm not. I'm not for that. I'm saying that it is not a priority, and we could press the US that the policymakers, that there should be a different approach to deal with the situation in Palestine, i.e. occupation, because at the end of the day, it is about occupation. It is not about a conflict. It's not about two people fighting. It is one side subjecting the other side to its brutal military, settler colonial rule in the land of Palestine.
Does anyone want to chime in? I can go to the next question if not. There's a follow-up to what John said. Let's see. Can you give an example on how we could be on the offense legally? Can we sue the U.S. government as the supplier of the weapons that violate Palestinian human rights? If not, what can we do to stop the arming of Israel short of congressional action?
Now, that's an important question. And I think that there is an opportunity now with the change in the composition of the Congress that issues like this can gain some traction. There has been increasing discussion by some members of Congress about the aid that the United States gives to Israel. I hesitate to call it aid because Israel is not a poor country. I think some others call it a form of tribute, like what is paid by a vassal state to a dominant state. That's probably a more accurate characterization. So I think, from what has been said here, in particular by Dr. Osama and Dr. Omar, about the change in the perception in the United States now of the situation, that there is a great opportunity to go on the offensive. Whether that can be done by some kind of legal action, I think that is very difficult. I think it needs to be done by political action. I don't think there's a great opportunity for, filing a lawsuit to prevent the Congress from giving money to Israel. But I think there is a good opportunity for political action.
Yeah, if I can jump in on that. I think, exactly as Professor Quigley was saying, I think sometimes a way of taking action that isn't a direct being on the legal offensive, but is kind of a nice intermediary is, for example, this occurs to me, I didn't mention it in my talk, but one of the things that nonprofit spaces do is sometimes you seize on the political openings that Dr. Osama was describing, and you try to create discourse around them, create a buzz around them, and even create campaigns around them. So, when you have Congress people like Jamal Bowman, for example, tweeting, about medical apartheid, for example, you create content around that, you create campaigns around that, you create statements around that. And at times you create campaigns that get people to call members of Congress to look into things, to start taking action. Now, each of these campaigns in and of themselves is not necessarily effective if you measure efficacy by does something change. Israel is still an apartheid state, obviously, right? It's still colonizing. But if you think about each of these things having kind of a granular effect where they're repeated over and over and over, you realize that there's kind of a slow drip effect whereby you're altering consciousness, you're raising awareness, because the people who called that member of Congress for the previous statement are now aware, and they're going to be ready and primed when the actual campaign that takes off, which you never know what it will be, also occurs. And just to jump in very quickly on the previous question, I think Dr. Osama is absolutely right. It's not on those of us who are raising, the charge against Israel for its brutality to be in the space to raise a state solution. And in fact, the question of a state solution is used to deflect from that. You bring it up and they say, well, what do you support? It doesn't matter. I don't support what's happening, obviously, and you shouldn't either, right? So if I say one versus the other, all of a sudden it's delegitimized. But I think what's interesting is that over time, the conditions of possibility or the limitations of the conditions of possibility can change. So even those who claim to support the two-state solution, I think over time, that's going to be seen as an insufficient limit for the boundaries of arguing for Palestine. And I think remaining in the struggle over time, we may see a moment where that actually takes place.
Thank you. Yes. Tahir, we got a couple questions about how people can get involved and support indigenous agricultural economies, like how you were describing. How can people support an economy that is so dictated and so narrowed by Israeli, apartheid demands and dictates? So how can Palestinians under occupation or siege establish an economy that is disengaged from Israel? Is that even possible? And if yes, how? And how can supporters outside Palestine help in this? Are there any studies or a set of recommendations that can guide us in this sphere?
شكرا. هو بالفعل طبعا
indeed, the most important thing about the Palestinian community in Palestine is that it's under siege, and the greatest challenge is how to break that siege. So how they work from inside to break that siege. The two experiences and examples I talked about demonstrate that there is a possibility. It's hard, and those are probably unstable examples and experiences. However, we must continue to try because, as we have seen, the opposite experience, which is the Oslo economic model, which enhanced economic dependency on Israel, and the orientation and the tendency towards liberalizing the economy by integrating the local economy into the international economy, led into further dependency of the Palestinians. So it is important to continue on at the level of the community, to try, even at the level of neighborhoods or localities, to build a self-reliant model. And those experiences I talked about are examples that show that this is possible, and that's the important thing, is to focus that there are experiences at the level of the Gaza Strip that reached a significant level of self-reliance as well as capacity building. So the point is that in Gaza and inside Palestine in general, the focus is on not only secure self-reliance at the level of food security, but also beyond food security. We tried to develop and train new capacities in many sectors, including industrial, educational, health services. So we're trying to alleviate the level of qualification of human resources, and whatever support we're able to provide from outside. But what Israel has been trying to do, and which it had succeeded in before Oslo and even more after Oslo, is that it succeeded in isolating Palestinians inside from Palestinians outside and from the whole world as a whole. So everything that goes into Palestine needed to go through the designated channels designated in the Oslo Accords that are monitored by the World Bank, Israel, etc. So this kind of funding and unfortunately is contributing to furthering such economic dependency and is not allowing Palestinians to work on developing resistance economy. However, today there are funding channels, probably at a smaller level, that are still possible, including associations or even individuals. However, again, the idea is how we outside Palestine can sort of orient that funding. It's not just to assist people inside to improve their living standard, but to provide more targeted funding that is based on a new economic and political vision to contribute to the building of a resistance economy away from, and also in addition to the funding and financial support, support can be provided through many other means, including education. Today, it's easy to have communication and to train people on new technologies and new venues and use horizons that have not been available inside. Even from outside, we can provide that training online in the areas that are much needed inside Palestine. I'm saying this from the experience of Gaza, which is an example that demonstrates how the people of Gaza are making use of such opportunities by having now very highly qualified engineers who have got their education outside Gaza or have received their education even inside Gaza and have yet received a high quality education. But also there is to break the siege by actually shedding light on those experiences in order to consolidate them and enhance them and further shame and expose the Israeli practices to narrow down on those and crack down on those experiences. So shedding light on them and those successes and providing all the capacities we can from outside, all of this can be provided as a contribution for a resistance economy. Most importantly, of course, is to have the vision in place and the will. And today in Palestine, and it has always been the case in my point of view, when in Palestine we have a clearer vision, it's easier for those outside to understand what appropriate role they can play. And that's what's happening today. Palestinians inside Palestine have a clearer vision of what they need to do. And now it's easier for us outside to think of how to better support them.
Thank you. And a quick follow-up. Can you comment on the effectiveness of boycotting Israel, let's say through tourism, versus visiting and showing direct support to Palestinians and Palestinian businesses? Are there any empirical studies on which way is better, even if we ignore the fact that a visit, by definition, when done under Israeli sovereignty, is by itself a huge concession?
ايه عفوا ما فهمتش انه السؤال كان موجه الي بس اذا ممكن تعيدي اول السؤال.
I didn't understand that it was the question was for me. Please repeat the first part of the question.
Sure. Sure, sorry. Can you comment on the effectiveness of boycotting Israel through tourism versus visiting and showing direct support to Palestinians and Palestinian businesses?
طبعا هلا المسألتين متكاملتين يعني ما في.
Actually, both things complement each one complements the other. The boycotting is very important and critical. I didn't talk about boycotting because I see that there has been a lot of focus on boycotting, and there were genuine achievements. And I can say a couple of words about that. But I wanted in my presentation to focus more on the role of the economy in the liberation movement. I can, in terms of the boycotting, maybe my colleagues in the United States are more aware about the achievements of boycotting in the United States. For example, here in France, I know that the battle was important on different levels. First, it played a role because the solidarity movement was effective to show solidarity with Palestine. In the past, the role of BDS, for example, it used to have seminars and demonstrations, but the role was more iconic than genuine. The idea of boycotting that it is for solidarity with Palestine to do something directly, not only to boycott something, but also to go to the markets or the malls and to lead a campaign to boycott a certain product. So that was an important achievement. And there were other achievements. For example, there were some artists who showed their boycotting support for the boycotting of Israel, and of course, the French authorities, like other authorities in the world, they forbid the boycotting to or those to show support. So we can see here that this movement came from Palestine abroad, and here outside Palestine, we can have another field to show our solidarity with Palestine. What I was talking about is that we need to have a role to confront Israel, and we need to have a role in showing support for the battle of liberation or the struggle for liberation in order to break the siege. But both battles complement each other, and they are not mutually exclusive.
Thank you. And finally to Omar. Oh, sure.
I'm sorry, I'm just going to add to what Professor Tahir just said. You know, I think we have to differentiate between two levels. One, visiting Palestine/Israel for just the sake of tourism and visiting Palestine/Israel to learn more about what the Palestinians are going through. And as Dr. Omar, I think in his bio that he worked with Witness Palestine, which we worked before with. And we sent delegations, students, activists from different backgrounds and different religious affiliations to go and learn about the struggle of the Palestinian people, what they go through. And many of the activists for Palestine are people who were, affected and influenced by the situation on the ground when they went and visited the Palestine, and they've seen what the people are going through there. So I would say such trips to Palestine are needed, and the way that like an organization like Eyewitness Palestine do it is that they make sure that you go by Palestinian, you spend time with Palestinians, you spend your money with Palestinians. So you're not benefiting the occupation, although it is still you're going under their sovereignty, but that is that's the reality on the ground. It's not something that we can change. In fact, that's why we send delegations, and we want people to go so that they can change the perception, and hopefully we change the politics and the policy later on. The other level that I want to talk about is when we talk about divestment as opposed to boycott. There is a reason why Israel formed a ministry called the Ministry of Strategic Affairs and Public Diplomacy in 2006. It is because this divestment campaign was hurting Israel, and it is hurting and continues to hurt Israel today. On an economical level, when you have major, let's say here in the US, you have major church chains, denominations divesting from Israel. That is hurting Israel economically. When you label, products made in settlements, illegal settlements, as coming from there, that is hurting Israel. So on an economical level, it is hurting Israel. But what is more important is the message that it sends, because basically it portrays Israel as the pariah as it is. Now you can create another parallel between Israel today as an apartheid regime, or at least being accused of it, though they don't like it, and what the apartheid regime that existed in South Africa. And that is something they don't like. They don't like it. Therefore, those who are engaged in BDS, or those who are activists for BDS, are banned from going back to Palestine. I am banned from going back to Palestine, although I never been there in my life, but I am banned because basically, I wasn't accused of anything other than that this ministry issued a booklet that has names. Those are the activists in the West for BDS. So you're denied based on what we call here in America a First Amendment right to freedom of expression. In America, you can, one state can boycott or divest from another state or boycott it, like when California divested from Arizona over the treatment of illegal and undocumented immigrants, or divesting from a state like South Carolina over the transgender bathrooms. So it is okay. No one says this is un-American. But when it comes to BDS, that becomes immediately anti-Semitic. Again, they cannot win the argument on its merits. So I think BDS is a very effective tool, whether on an economical level or, and that's what is more important, the symbolic level, because it, again, portrays Israel for what it is, as an apartheid regime, as a pariah that does not uphold the human norms, the legal norms, international norms, and we should continue to advance and to stress this point until we change enough perception here in worldwide to change policy later on.
Thank you, Dr. Osama. Finally, to Omar, and then I'll have you just with your start your closing statements after you answer this question very briefly. Although it's a huge question, many American Muslims or Palestinian and Arab Americans cross certain quote unquote red lines, thinking they are advancing the Palestinian cause, particularly with Zionist or non-Palestinian related activities. So basically normalization. Can you comment on why these relations are dangerous and why working with Zionists is the same as working with white supremacists and must be considered a red line that must never be allowed to be crossed?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I know we're out of time, but hopefully other panelists can jump in on this because I think it's very important. I was discussing in my talk the idea of sort of different narratives that Zionism uses to maintain itself. And one of them is the idea of kind of a centuries-old conflict, that what's happening in Palestine is religiously based, that it's about these two feuding religious communities that just can't see eye to eye and can't get along. And so, what happens as a result of that argument is you get projects that are, normalizing interfaith projects, which basically say, okay, we need to have religious cooperation, we need to have Jewish and Muslim leaders sort of come together, and maybe even visit Israel together, and the problem with that is that it's, as the question phrases, and I think the questioner knows this, it's sort of an awareness raising question, it seems, but, when you talk about normalization, you're talking about making the colonial power dynamic, hiding that, basically making it seem as though it really is sort of an individual or a relationship-based issue rather than one of political domination, subjugation, and colonization. So interfaith strategies, are one way of doing that. When you're talking about interfaith work, that specifically conflates Zionism and Judaism, which is definitely not the case, right? Zionism is not interchangeable with Judaism, and Zionism is not anti-Semitism, right? But there are some interfaith work that kind of does that. And then you also basically, so the issue with that, I think, is that it kind of, on the one hand, furthers the idea of normalization, and it also kind of builds upon the misconception that this is a religious issue or is a religious cause in the specific Zionist narrative, I mean here, where it's the centuries-old struggle, and can mislead people into actually continuing to believe that rather than raising awareness about the political oppression that is faced by Palestinians. So finally, about, why is this akin to normalizing with white supremacy? Basically because I think Zionism is white supremacy, right? Zionism is a form of racial domination. Zionism is a form of racial subjugation. Israel has its own racial hierarchies, right? It has its own form of supremacy. I think the only reason that it's been difficult for progressives to understand that is because there's an inability to grapple with the seeming contradiction that anti-Semitism, European anti-Semitism, which was a huge racist problem, right, could have produced, among many, many, many other Jewish responses, one of them being a colonial movement. So the idea of racism and colonialism following each other is so incompatible, people panic at that, and they deny the reality of Zionism, which was to create a project of Jewish supremacy as a response to Jewish persecution. Now, Zionism was never widely accepted within the Jewish community at that time, and today remains and continues to be challenged. So this is not about religious identities. It's about political subjugation and domination and continuing to challenge that. And it's ultimately incumbent on people who claim to be for racial justice to understand that Zionism is a supremacist ideology, a supremacist project. Israel is a racial, supremacist, genocidal, and fascist, as Dr. Osama said, state. And normalization has to be an absolute red line in the same way that white supremacy in the United States is.
Thank you. Let's have closing statements. We only have about 6 minutes in total, so short and sweet closing statements. We'll start with you, Professor John Quigley.
Thank you. And I hope we can inject a new concept into our activism, namely the concept of denial of repatriation. That's a term that you probably haven't heard before, but the issue of repatriation to date has been talked about as something that needs to be negotiated between the Palestinians and the Israelis. I think we have to stop thinking about it in that way. We have to start thinking about it as a crime, and it is defined in the statute of the International Criminal Court in a way that is susceptible to making it a crime. So the watchword that I leave you with is denial of repatriation.
Thank you so much. Professor Tahir Labadi. Oh, I think you're muted.
بحب أعكس هيك يمكن ككلمة أخيرة.
As a conclusion, I would like to say maybe not how we outside can benefit the Palestinians inside, but to make use of their experience inside Palestine. The economy of resistance is putting forward the foundations and the principles and values for an economy that can be in the service of the society and for the liberation of society. And I believe one of the most important tools to lift the siege on this experience is to learn from it, and we need to find other experiences to learn from and to deal with the economy in a new way, not to deal with the economy just for profit and for the sake of economy, but rather for the service of a community and with values that the entire society agrees on. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Dr. Osama.
Well, thank you again for inviting me to this conference, and I've learned a great deal from all of the panelists here. You know, as an activist for Palestine in the West, I just want those who hear us in the West to believe in the power of their voice and to believe in our ability to make real change and substantive change for Palestine. You know, I'm someone who have been through it for almost 20 years now, actually more than 20 years. And I've seen how the tide has shifted. I've seen how the trajectory has changed in this country. And I've seen where politicians, or some politicians at least, don't see, you know, speaking out for Palestinian rights as a political suicide mission anymore. So this is a real change that is taking place, and people need to see this. I'll go back to the question that was directed to Dr. Omar about normalizers, because this is a pandemic that we're dealing with here in the United States, mainly, unfortunately, with imams. Muslim imams, those who are supposed to be holding, standing for justice and defending the rights of the oppressed, not the oppressor. We've seen this problem time and time again, and it continues to be an issue for us. And I would say to those people that the inferiority complex mentality will take us nowhere. This country, the West, is not about people who accept subjugation, people who accept oppression. It's not for people who will lay down when the wind comes. It is for people who stand up and rise up and defend their rights. The last point I want to make is our cause and our fight for justice in Palestine is a multifaceted and multi-front struggle. It is not only in Palestine, it is not only in the surrounding countries, it is not only us in the United States, it's worldwide. We have so many fronts, and each one of us, everyone, wherever you are, you have a role. There is something that you can do, because eventually this is going to be an accumulative and a collective work that will gradually build up until we achieve justice in Palestine. And I will end with this. I mean by justice for everyone, for all. We're not in the business of negation, but we're also not in the business of apologizing or justifying oppression and repression and occupation and whatever supremacy and fascism that exists out there. Being Muslim, being Jews, being Christian, it doesn't matter. But in this case, we're dealing with an Israeli occupation, a Zionist ideology that hijacked a religion, that claims to speak for it. So we will speak out against it. I'm not in the business now of equating the oppressed and the oppressor and say Palestinians have to prove that they're human beings, that they deserve to live free in order for Israel to give them their freedom. This is what they're being asked. And this is something that we had a discussion with some officials in some department here, where I said, only the Palestinians who have been demanded to prove that they're worthy of being free, worthy of having an independent state, worthy of having their human rights, worthy of having the right of return, worthy of your respect, and worthy of being treated as a human beings. And Palestinians don't have to prove none of the above, because they are free and they are dignified people and they deserve freedom, and they will achieve it and restore it, whether the whole world likes it or not. It is going to happen as long as we continue this fight and continue to speak for the voiceless here.
Thank you so much. We have like 30 seconds left. Dr. Omar, what's your closing statement?
So very quickly, one thing I've been sitting with is that when you're involved in a long-term struggle, you realize it's not about the individual, but it's about the collective. We need to keep saying the things you've been saying them over and over, and we need to have other people say the same things over and over in all of the spaces that we're in, and understand the unique limitations and opportunities of each of those spaces, and really work together to make sure that the message gets out. I've been very moved to see how interconnected the Palestine activist community has become, in particular, I think since May. And I think it's a good demonstration of that. Things won't necessarily change overnight, but you keep saying what you're saying, and they may change in the long term. It's not necessarily going to be for you, but it's going to be for the struggle, and that's what matters the most.
Beautiful. Thank you to all of our panelists for being here today. What an honor to be all together and to hear from you all. And I'm going to turn it back to Yasmin, who's going to introduce the next session. Thank you all so much.
Thank you to all the panelists. Thank you, Ms. Coming up, we have our fifth day session number 10 that will be starting at 8 p.m. Istanbul Standard Time, 2200 hours, and we look forward to hosting you back at that time. We're going to have a great panel that is sure to enlighten and educate. So